Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this BISA lunchtime seminar. I'm David Feldman, the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And I'm really ever so pleased to be able to introduce our speaker today, Marc Volovici, not least, but not only, because Marc is an old friend of the Institute, having been here for 5 years, I think. So it's great to have him back. Marc is now the Alfred Landecker Lecturer at the University of Haifa's Department of Jewish History. He is the author of a terrific book, German as a Jewish Problem, The Language Politics of Jewish Nationalism, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2020. And he is co-editor with me, but actually did most of the heavy lifting, of Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and the Politics of Definition, which has just been published by Palgrave Macmillan. Marc's paper today is drawn from his current research project, which is another reason why I'm especially eager to hear him and hear it. And his title is Between Self-Determination and Self-Censorship, Anti-Semitism and Interwar Jewish Politics. Marc.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Jan and Tan, for organizing the event. I'm really pleased to be invited. As David mentioned, I was a member of this institute for several years, and it really feels natural to stay in touch and to present some of my current work in this forum. So I'm really excited about that. So I'll go straight to the material and share my screen. I hope. All right. Okay. So in today's talk, I wish to explore a question that hovered in the background of interwar Jewish politics, whether and to what extent the conduct of Jewish politics should be affected by how it might be weaponized by anti-Semitic agitators. This question had various possible answers. One approach took a self-assertive stance, which put Jewish political interests, however understood, before any other consideration. The opposite stance advocated a more cautious conduct, which is mindful of the precarious position of Jews in different parts of the world, and therefore treats Jewish political action in relation to how it might be instrumentalized. Between these two poles, there existed a range of options, hesitations, compromises and dilemmas, and political maneuvers that constitute Jewish minoritarian politics. This dilemma, to be sure, is not unique to the Jewish minority, nor is it particularly modern. But in the interwar period, Jews grappled with it with growing intensity, both because anti-Semitism was on the rise, and because various parties and Jewish parties and movements advanced different immediate practical solutions to the political and economic crisis Jews were facing, first and foremost in Eastern Europe. A few words should also be said about the specific traits of Jewish minoritarianism in this context. One of the pillars of modern anti-Semitic conspiracy theories is the allegation that Jews were a subversive element in society or a state within a state. This accusation also aimed at paralyzing Jewish political actors because any attempt to organize politically could potentially confirm, so to speak, the idea that Jews constitute a separate political entity and thus feed further accusations of disloyalty. No text was more straightforward about this allegation and more popular than the forged protocols of the Elders of Zion, which were published at the turn of the century, the 20th century, and which became extremely popular in the wake of the First World War. It was for this reason that during the interwar period, Jewish political activists often had to consider the possible implications of how they formulate and advance the idea of Jewish national self-determination, and whether they should tone down their political position on the national rights of Jews. The concern was entangled with a set of broad questions that underlie the very praxis of modern Jewish politics. Such questions are: who has the right to speak for the Jews, and is it advisable at all to have anyone speak for them as a collective? How should the connections and sense of solidarity between different Jewish communities be defined in an age of national allegiances? How should Jewish political organizations respond to radical voices coming from within Jewish communities, but which defy the authority and policies of the established leadership? How should disagreements be handled? Should Jewish political activists exercise caution when criticizing other Jews due to the threat of their words being instrumentalized by anti-Semites? I will now present two examples of radical political initiatives that brought these questions to the surface. The first is a failed and forgotten attempt that took place in the US to establish a World Jewish Congress and thereby to democratize the Jewish people in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. I will then present different plans for the mass migration of Polish Jews in the 1930s. There is no direct relation between these two case studies, but they often touch on similar questions, which is why I put them one next to the other. Each of these cases sheds light, I hope, on key traits of Jewish politics and its confrontation with anti-Semitic realities and anti-Semitic threats. And I will return to this point at the end of my talk. So the first figure I will focus on is Abraham Schomer, a rather marginal figure in Zionist politics in New York, who had no financial means and who found very limited support among major Jewish political organizations. In the wake of the First World War, while Jewish statesmen sought to advance Jewish national rights in the Paris Peace Conference, Schomer called for the establishment of a World Jewish Congress. His was a failed initiative, but it was an interesting failure because it received a considerable amount of attention in the Jewish and non-Jewish press across the world and forced leading figures in Jewish liberal, Zionist, and Orthodox organizations to articulate their political and emotional response to it. Schomer was born in 1876 in Pinsk, the son of a popular Yiddish playwright who migrated with his family to New York in 1890. Abraham Schomer was a lawyer and a playwright in Yiddish and English. He was also an activist in immigration aid organizations and participated in attempts to assist Jewish communities battered by anti-Semitic violence in the Russian Empire in 1905. Shortly afterwards, he started entertaining bigger ideas and published pamphlets and books addressing the crisis of Jewish political powerlessness. In his 1907 pamphlet, How We Can Help Ourselves, Schomer wrote, "It is a curious phenomenon. If an individual Jew is libeled or robbed, he will obtain redress, he will complain to the courts, appeal to the law, and sooner or later get justice. But when the Jewish nation is insulted and robbed, it does nothing and obtains no redress. With others, it is the nation that is a power, while the individual counts for little. With the Jews, it is the reverse. The weakness of the Jewish nation is due to the fact that it is not organized and has no central representative organization." Despite his overall support of Zionism, Schomer found it inadequate in addressing the urgent dangers Jews were facing. Anti-Semitism, in his view, is the result of the inability of society to understand what Jews are. In a book titled The Primary Cause of Anti-Semitism, Schomer argued that owing to Jewish existence as a diasporic minority, the object of age-old stories and myths, non-Jews don't quite know how to make sense of actual ordinary Jews living among them. Old prejudices and hatreds have waned, but the idea of the Jews in popular imagination has remained immersed in mystery and fear, and in certain circumstances gives rise to suspicion and hostility. Jews are reduced to a set of images without them being able to present themselves, speak for themselves, and plead for their rights as a recognizable social body. Jews are not merely passive in this state of affairs, according to Schomer. They too see themselves through popular images and projections, not as members of a coherent group that can be addressed and represented. They too lack the capacity of thinking of themselves in political terms, and in this sense, they too perpetuate that prejudice. He wrote, "We are a headless body of which the nations are unconsciously and secretly afraid. But when we will have a head to our people, we shall no more be mysterious. We shall be a nation like all nations. We shall become a living body, and as such, necessarily respected by all." Jews needed, therefore, a democratically elected leadership that would speak on behalf of Jews worldwide, fight for their rights as a national minority, and advance the claim for equality wherever Jews face discrimination and persecution. Schomer moved from theory to action, and in the following years appealed to various Jewish political organizations with a plan for the establishment of a permanent Jewish Congress. The initiative was reported in the American Yiddish press, but it was only in the wake of the First World War that the idea started to gain popularity amid the anti-Semitic violence in the Russian Civil War, the immigration restrictions put in place in the US and Britain, and the dissemination of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the US, famously sponsored by Henry Ford. A wealth of documents, press clippings, and private correspondence stored in YIVO and other archives entail heated debates between numerous figures in the Jewish political sphere over Schomer's plan. This certainly derives from the sensitive moment in Jewish and international politics at the time, but also from his sharp, aggressive, and provocative tone. Schomer seemed unconcerned with how his words echoed anti-Jewish images, making stark and often offensive generalizations about Jews. For example, he wrote, "Having no head, the Jewish people is incapable of deliberating, resolving, and acting in a personal capacity. It is a mere multitude. It is an assemblage of individuals without a will. It is a mob." Or consider this illustration, which appeared on one of his brochures, showing the American Congress with the Star of David hanging on it. His idea was to envision a World Jewish Congress, but it reproduced an anti-Semitic idea of Jews controlling the national politics of their country. Schomer set up a committee to plan the World Jewish Congress and received support from activists, some intellectuals, and public figures in the US and Europe. The responses that he received ranged, however, from enthusiasm to skepticism, bewilderment, and horror. Some praised Schomer for the ideas and joined the initiative, hoping that this would be a watershed moment. One editorial in the Yiddish periodical justified the call for an international Jewish Congress, explaining, "This is no longer a question concerning Russian Jews or Romanian Jews. Jews are being targeted everywhere, including in Britain and in the US. If the anti-Semitic plot is against all Jews, then Jews have every right to defend themselves and organize. If the trouble is international, the response to it should be international too." Another editorial referred to the fact that Jewish organizations have been reluctant to form a Jewish Congress, despite ongoing popular pressure to do so. This caricature from the period illustrated this dynamic. We see the figure of Abraham Schomer sitting as if he was a rooster, basically, on an egg. The egg stands for the idea of the World Jewish Congress. And then the chicken, which stands for the established Jewish community, comes and asks, "What happens? Since when roosters are sitting on an egg? Isn't it my job?" Then he answers, "If you're not going to do it, somebody has to do it, and I'll just jump in." Other responses in the press were concerned that the idea of a Jewish Congress would only give anti-Semites more ways to misrepresent the Jews, as one editorial put it. An Austrian Jewish Orthodox journal, Jüdische Presse, reported on Schomer's initiative and described it as a naive effort that reveals a lack of understanding of the political condition of Jews in Europe. Schomer received an equally critical response in private letters, for example, from Cyrus Adler, a professor of Semitic languages, prominent figure in Jewish civic organizations, and a fierce opponent of Jewish nationalism. He wrote to Schomer, "I believe you have exaggerated the conditions, but even if they are as bad as you have stated, Your proposed action will only aggravate them. I personally have not the slightest doubt that the Jewish Congress and nationalist movements in America and throughout the world during the past 10 years, which have been produced by agitation and propaganda such as you are now engaged in, must bear a share of the responsibility for the conditions of which we now complain. Your proposed step at this juncture is the worst and most dangerous which could be taken. Julian Mack and Nathan Strauss, leading Jewish politicians who supported Zionist organizations, also wrote personally to Shomer, asking him to abandon this plan. Strauss wrote in his letter, "I disapprove most earnestly and for various reasons, chiefly because of the claim in the forged protocols that the Jews are aiming at world domination. No matter how false and absurd such a claim may be, an international congress called at this time would be considered by the anti-Semites as a proof for their ludicrous assertions. Do me a favor, my dear Mr. Shomer, and withdraw your invitations. I know that after a serious reflection, you will agree with me as to the inadvisability and danger of the undertaking." One of the most publicized meetings Shomer convened was attended by a leading Orthodox rabbi, Bernard Drachman, who used the opportunity to speak against the initiative and against Jewish nationalist activism more broadly. He claimed that the Congress would, quote, aggravate the disease from which we are suffering, putting water on the mill of Henry Ford. He is accusing us of trying to rule the world and of forming an international organization seeking world domination. They will take advantage of us and prove that what they were saying is true. He added, if Polish Jews said that they were just a religious group, they would be more desirable in those places. The claim of Jewish nationalism is bringing them all their trouble. Drachman apparently was unaware that several reporters attended the meeting, including a journalist from the New York Times. The presence of major news outlets in this meeting attested to the unusual attention granted to this otherwise marginal figure in the Jewish political sphere. An article was published on the following day in the New York Times, and it indeed highlighted the objections raised by Drachman. The fact that Drachman's reproach of Polish Jews and Jewish nationalism appeared in the New York Times generated discomfort in the Jewish public sphere. A leading religious and political figure had publicly ascribed to Jewish political activists responsibility for antisemitism. One writer in a Yiddish periodical responded critically to Drachman's critique and wondered acerbically whether it is the duty of the Jews to appease Henry Ford. The debate on the idea of the Congress turned into a debate on how to debate the idea of the Congress. Drachman then gave an interview to a Yiddish newspaper and clarified. He said, "I admit that what I said should have been said in a closed room. This tactical mistake, however, does not change the point that I made. I stand by my view and I see it as clear as day that it would be a danger to say to the world that politically we did not fully belong to the United States, that outside of being American, we also belong to a strictly political organization." In the absence of any institutional support, the Congress did not materialize, and Shomer gradually retreated from the public stage. A World Jewish Congress was eventually established in 1936 in the context of the much graver crisis of European Jewry, and was led by prominent figures in Jewish communities, and particularly in the Zionist movement, which had become by then the leading power in Jewish diaspora politics. Let me now turn to another path of action advocated by Jewish activists amid the dire condition of Jews in Eastern Europe, mass immigration. In his study of interwar Polish Jewry, historian Kenneth Moss pointed to a rapidly spreading politics of doubt that was shared by growing numbers of Polish Jews of various political affiliations who exhibited, quote, a growing interest in exit from Poland and Europe in search of something better. During the 1930s, left-wing and right-wing Zionists, territorialists, and other Jewish groups pondered ideas of mass migration. The Polish government also entertained different options of Jewish migration, and the nationalist and anti-Semitic press advocated it in increasingly violent terms. Jewish political activists pursuing ideas of exit confronted the question of whether it was possible to advance Jewish migration in a manner that would maintain Jewish political self-assertion and not be perceived as a surrender to the anti-Semitic drive toward expulsion of Jews. Some Polish Jews felt that there was no point in trying to depict the departure of Jews from Poland in positive or empowering terms. For example, Michał Glaser, a Jewish economist, reached out in 1936 and 1937 to the Polish, British, and American governments with an elaborate plan for the organized migration of Polish Jews. Glaser admitted in a foreword, and I quote, "I feel bound to demonstrate for the benefit of those adverse to the Jews that the solution of the Jewish problem along the lines proposed by me coincides with their ideology and its closing postulate." Glaser was not a party member and as such felt perhaps more comfortable highlighting the affinity between Jewish and anti-Jewish ideas of mass migration. Other plans of Jewish migration had to deal more directly with these echoes. In August 1936, a Zionist leader and former member of the Polish parliament, Yitzhak Grünbaum, spoke in a press conference in Warsaw to the Polish press and stated that the anti-Semitic agitation and the hostility makes it ever more vital to advance immediately a plan of mass migration. He was criticized in the Jewish press, especially among the press associated with the Bund and with the Orthodox parties, for choosing to acknowledge the effectiveness of anti-Semitic policies rather than to fight them. In a response to his critics, Grünbaum rejected the criticism of Bundist activists and said that according to their logic, acknowledging the need of Polish Jews to emigrate inevitably means a justification of anti-Jewish discrimination, hatred, and expulsion. This binary approach, which creates a political scene with only two possible positions, for the anti-Semites or against the anti-Semites, makes it increasingly difficult to advance a peaceful political action that would improve the condition of Jews. This, he added, would also only lead to further isolation of Jews in society. A few weeks later, Vladimir Jabotinsky, the Russian Jewish leader of the revisionist party, embarked on a diplomatic effort to convince the Polish government and other East European governments to support his plan for the evacuation of European Jews, as he called it. After the death of Marshal Pilsudski in 1935, the Polish government took on a harder line against Jews and advanced an anti-Jewish boycott. It also appeared more determined to advance immigration plans of Jews, which for Jabotinsky was an opportunity to strengthen the status of the Jewish community in Palestine. He met with the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Józef Beck, and with the staff of the Polish Prime Minister, Sławomir Składkowski. He hoped to have the Poles negotiate with the British Empire to enable an immigration of 1.5 million Jews to Palestine, half of which would come from Poland and the rest from Romania, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Austria, and the Baltic states. One way of convincing Polish politicians was by presenting the potential benefits it could offer to Poland. In a letter to Minister Beck, Jabotinsky stated, "Friendly government, which in the name of humanitarian principles and in line with its own political interests, would offer the British Mandate authorities a constructive plan for large-scale colonization, would gain the support of the entire Jewish people, by which I mean not only political parties and organizations, but all the moral, political, financial forces, all influential Jews in the press, in banks, in parliaments, etc." In another letter to Polish diplomat Tadeusz Gwiazdowski, Jabotinsky addressed the potential merit of the evacuation plan for Poland and invoked the Balfour Declaration. And the original is in English. Many people firmly believe today that the best piece of policy England showed in this generation was the Balfour Pledge and its consequences. And then he continues, "I say with the utmost assurance that the second step would even be greater, and that would be concrete and deliberate move to transform Zionism from a plaything into a scheme of salvation. The country which took this initiative would, by this act, step on a magic carpet." In a speech to a Polish think tank of sorts, Jabotinsky further expanded on the potential value of the evacuation plan and stated, there is no need to overestimate the power of the Jewish collectivity in the world, but it shouldn't be underestimated either. Sometimes Jews are unable to convince governments to have rioters arrested in some godforsaken village, and sometimes great countries are pleading for Jews' assistance. Nowadays, this international collectivity has a matter that is dear to its heart, the land of Israel. Those who will assist us will build in this way an economic and moral fortress, not only by the Suez Canal, but across many continents and seas. Jabotinsky launched his public campaign in an essay for a Polish non-Jewish newspaper, precisely because he believed that this was the path to make the plan audible and be seen as a serious diplomatic endeavor. But Jabotinsky wished to join forces with a government that openly promoted the boycott of Jews as Jews. Moreover, Jabotinsky was a Russian Jew, and the authority with which he sought to negotiate on the future of Polish Jews was questionable. A newspaper associated with the Bund wrote that Jabotinsky should be condemned for his militaristic language, using the term of evacuation, which echoed the Russian Tsar's expulsion of Jews from combat areas during the World War. As Daniel Blattman has argued, the Bund was opposed as a matter of principle to the Zionist idea of establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine, but even more outrageous in their eyes was Jabotinsky's attempt to collaborate with the hostile government. The ultra-Orthodox newspaper, Das Jüdische Tagblatt, opposed what it termed the revisionist adventure that aimed to shatter Jewish life in Poland. In a commentary from September 1936, one op-ed writes, "We're not in London or Paris. This is Warsaw, and we cannot allow this kind of words to be written here. While we, the Jews of Poland, are conducting a fight for our lives in our own country, which we do not want to live, Jabotinsky comes and tells the Polish state that Jews need to be evacuated from Poland, that the anti-Semites are essentially not wrong." Jabotinsky tried to answer these concerns in a series of articles and interviews in the Jewish press. In an interview to Nash Przegląd, he attempted to clarify what he meant by evacuation and admitted that it may have been a problematic choice of words using to its connotation with forced migration. He added that the plan should be understood more as a form of self-evacuation, similar to the exodus envisioned by Theodor Herzl. In a speech to a Jewish professional union in Warsaw a few days afterwards, Jabotinsky explained that it would be more sensible to try to mobilize governments by talking about an evacuation rather than an exodus, because the latter would insinuate that these governments are comparable with the Pharaoh's enslavement of the Jews. With regard to the claim that he was making business with anti-Semites, Jabotinsky answered, "I would advise you to be more cautious before labeling certain governments as anti-Semitic." He pointed to the fact that prejudice and discrimination against Jews exists also within allegedly friendly and Western governments as well, but no one in their right mind would refuse to negotiate with them on the status of Jews and depict them bluntly as anti-Semitic countries or anti-Semitic governments. The evacuation plan did not gain sufficient support among Jewish parties or in the international arena, and remained a contentious symbol in Israeli society over the roads not taken during the 1930s. Much of the sensitivity lies precisely in the moral and political dilemmas over how Jews should fight anti-Semitism. In some ways, the range of perspectives and dilemmas addressed in interwar debates, such as these discussed today, were fairly self-reflective about the nature of the dilemmas and the difficult choices that ought to be made when tackling anti-Semitism. Both Greenbaum and Jabotinsky, who were fierce political rivals, shared an understanding that the use of the label anti-Semitic is in some ways a speech act and should be treated as such. So let me conclude with several broader propositions that hopefully tie together some of the themes that I touched on today. First, Prejudice affects the political culture of vulnerable minorities. It leaves a deep imprint on individuals' consciousness, but also on political organizations. Emotions such as fear, embarrassment, and shame become a political factor with a force of its own. In other words, minority politics are conducted in a mirror room, where each political action is accompanied by a set of calculations over how that action might be interpreted or weaponized. Second, it is difficult to speak about Jewish power because facts and images of it are often closely intertwined. One of the paradoxes of Jewish political activism in the modern period consists in the fact that by uniting politically, Jews often reveal how divided they are. By organizing politically, they often reveal how little power they actually possess. At the same time, the assumption of invisible Jewish influence, which fueled anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, could in some contexts grant Jews a certain political leverage. Third, it should come as no surprise that controversial or radical figures claiming to speak on behalf of Jews are likely to receive more public and often diplomatic attention than more moderate figures. In this sense, they pose a threat to the reputation of their community because their words and actions can be easily instrumentalized. At the same time, the threat of anti-Semitic exploitation also provides other communal leaders with a powerful tool to consolidate their own power. It can serve to reject or suppress alternative claims to power. The very ability to warn that a certain idea poses an existential threat to the entire community can be effective in nipping oppositional voices in the bud. Finally, sociologist Jacob Katz argued that anti-Semitism owes much of its vitality to the fact that it was in constant interaction with various ideas of Jewish emancipation. This, it could be added, created a significant challenge for Jewish political activism amid the occasional overlap between Jewish fantasies of separation and their anti-Semitic counterparts. Thank you.
Marc, thank you. Thank you so much. That was a very rich and at the same time very stimulating. We have about half an hour for questions and discussions, so please, those of you who do have a question or a comment that you'd like to make, please do raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you. But to get things going, Marc, let me ask you something, which is that I was very struck both in your with your introductory questions and your concluding remarks, how you were talking about issues which, for example, the capacity of the fear of Jews appearing as a state within a state and the ways in which that might, for example, paralyze Jewish politics at one end, or at the other end of your talk, the impact of prejudice on Jewish politics. These are factors which might apply to any period of post-emancipation politics. But your paper focused on the interwar period. And it seems to me that the implication of your talk is that these issues that you were talking about took on a new appearance, perhaps a new difficulty in the interwar period. Perhaps, and perhaps this is me rather than you, I don't know, for a set of reasons which could be described in structural terms, that the nature of the world, of the political world that the Jews faced changed between 1917 and 1920, and we're seeing the effects of this. So I suppose my question is, is there something in this project with which you want to try to define not only the nature of these post-emancipation dilemmas, but a particular set of dilemmas which are particular to the interwar period?
Thank you. That's a really important question, and I admit that I grapple with it in some ways over sort of the scope of my research and also of the historical problem. So in some ways, I agree that this is in a story of Jewish emancipation, and some of these concerns have been raised when first Jewish international organizations were established in the 19th century. Same sort of fears, sometimes justified, sometimes still sort of anticipating a very negative outcome of how Jews should organize and assist sort of their other communities in a way that wouldn't jeopardize them. But there is a but, I think, and here I'm sort of following the insight of Amos Funkenstein that said that up until Theodor Herzl, Jewish organizations tried hard to maintain a political vacuum over the position of leadership of the Jewish people. Sort of there was, even in the Jewish organizations that did try to present a sort of universal front, emphasized very carefully what they were not, and they were not claiming to speak on behalf of Jews or to offer a solution to Jewish political misery in international terms, but more like to assist in a more humanitarian way and sort of a surgical way to different situations, especially in Eastern Europe, in North Africa, and so on. But once this sort of taboo was broken with Jewish nationalism, but more specifically with Herzl, that made it sort of a public event, then it gave rise to various other competing claims and ideas to sort of try to speak on behalf of the Jewish people and to offer a more radical and more sweeping and universal and sometimes more sort of belligerent responses to the various political crises of Jews, again, especially in Eastern Europe, but in some cases, of course, it also applied to others. So I agree that structurally the problem was there well before the interwar period and possibly also before the emancipation period, if we think of sort of the kahal politics of Jewish communities and so on. But the interwar period gave this sort of set of questions an intensity and also palpability that possibly wasn't there in earlier periods. But yeah, I really accept the sort of the pushback on that.
Thank you, Marc. Lisa Leff, you have a question or a comment. Nice to see you, Lisa.
Thank you, and it's nice to see you, David. And Marc, I really enjoyed your talk. I had a question about, your point that Jews who were trying to fight anti-Semitism were very conscious of how whatever they did might be interpreted by anti-Semites through an anti-Semitic lens. And I've always wondered when a sort of science developed for actually ascertaining how what they did politically was received. Were Jewish leaders, I worked on the 19th century, there doesn't seem to have been any attempts to actually measure response. You never see that in any papers. But today, obviously, any political organization will have whole departments that are doing polling and focus groups. I wondered if in the period you're looking at, where there's much more sophisticated political action, if there are, and also, social scientific methods, I wonder if you ever encountered any Jewish organizations that did actual investigation of how their speech was received, and also, or if they just worked on intuition. I mean, you just have such a rich source base, and I'm so jealous of that. So I wonder what you saw.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and in some, I mean, I should, I mean, the quick answer is that I should look into it. But the more sort of longer question, the longer answer is that you're right. You're right that there is definitely a more sort of consciousness, sort of the impact of these ideas. But it was a tricky thing, because on the one hand, the question of how it's received can often be sort of counterproductive. Is if, you know, say there's a, you know, the Balfour Declaration enhanced ideas of Jewish meddling with the British Empire. Is it something that the Zionists wanted to sort of figure out, or actually, you know, just advance Jewish national rights? You know, because there's always a question of I mean, until when do you care about how it's being perceived or instrumentalized, and also because, of course, so much of the criticism against the Jewish influence is not done, you know, as a form of dialogue, but as a way of defamation and so on. So in some ways, the question also remained unanswered. That said, in case of the World Jewish Congress, Shomer and his allies did use the service of those you know, press clippings organizations that just make sure that each time the idea of the Congress is invoked anywhere in the country or even in the world, then it immediately sort of being collated and filed and protocoled and examined. And that's partly how I was able to reach many of the responses to the Congress in different kind of Jewish and non-Jewish press. And there were sort of discussions on how to deal with sort of the positive and negative responses. Some of the, I mean, after the first wave of success of the Congress movement, there was also sort of kind of a wave of those who left it, because they reached the conclusion that it wouldn't gain the support of established Jewish parties, and then it just might lead to further sort of internal strife between the different Jewish parties. So in this sense, there was some kind of a learning process. But in terms of sort of a more data, you know, based social scientific methods, that's something, as I said, that's worth inquiring, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. But thank you.
Well, please do, Michael Baker. You have a question. Please do unmute yourself and ask. Or you have to unmute yourself, Michael.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Right. Can. Bearing in mind the later, well, actually during the 20s and the 30s, the connection that was made by many people, including anti-Semites, of course, between Jews and Bolshevism, I wondered whether there was any pushback on that front, which you don't mention at all in your talk.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an important part of the context, and to some degree, the fact that the protocols were sort of could be more so popular in the early 20s was due to the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution and the anti-Semitic propaganda that claimed that Jews were behind the revolution. So in this sense, again, the protocols were presented as a proof that they sort of were a prophecy of what Jews were about, and that they were aiming for world power, and the socialist revolution is just a means for that. So the context of specifically of the protocols is very much there, and I mean that's something that is also worthy of further study, because the American context is also special in some regard. The figures that I presented here today are anti-Bolsheviks, I mean, obviously, but so they sort of don't really tackle that. But but I do hope in the broader project also to sort of deal with this sort of boogeyman of the image of the Judeo-Bolshevik menace and what it means to Jewish politics. Paul Heinbrich wrote about that, but I think the Jewish angle again is not always sort of pushed through the end. I think, I mean, David is working on some aspects of that so I don't have a lot to say about that, but I agree it's an important part of the context.
Thank you.
Just coming back on that, Mark, I mean, one of the interesting things which I have found, which I think also relates to your larger theme, is the extent, in Britain at least, to which Anglicized Jewish elites, even if they did not believe in the veracity of the protocols, did believe that Bolshevism was Jewish. And so that gives a particular twist or an urgency to the politics of public image, which is, in a sense, a part of your theme.
Right. No, that's very interesting, and I am curious as to how this sort of belief is presented in public discussions, and so on. At least in one of the documents that I discussed today by this sort of independent Polish Jewish economist who sort of doesn't deny that anti-Semitism has won, and Jews should respond to it without sort of just accept sort of the fate that migration is the only way to save Polish Jewry. So he writes also about the mistakes that Jews have done along the way, and mentions their sort of support for their overall support for the Bolshevik Revolution, which again is factually not true, but back then, for reasons that deserve more attention, it was perceived almost as a basic fact, not even something to discuss. So yeah,
exactly. Thank you. Mike Burkhoff, you have a question or a comment?
Oh, hi. Yes, thank you, Mark. Very interesting discussion. I wanted to just look at the subject of evacuation that you mentioned in your discussion. I've got very little, no great sympathy for Jakobliński. Sorry, pronounced the name wrong there. However, I want to know when evacuation became an almost undeniable project. I mean, the biggest movements of Jews historically, in modern times anyway, occurred at the second part of the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, up to 1914, particularly. But after the rise of the Nazis and Stalinism, with its increasingly anti-Semitic features, there was obviously an argument for evacuation to almost anywhere in the world, not just the Zionist idea that it had to be to what is now Israel. Here in Britain, we had a very small, unfortunately too small, a movement with the kinder transport. Great though it was only a certain number of people. Do you think that that there should have been a much more wide political debate within Jews for evacuation to wherever that could be, rather than it being split between to what was then Palestine and those who just were against that? Do you think that was perhaps a negative effect at the time in the interwar period after the rise of Hitler?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll just say 2 points in relation to that. First, you're right that the sort of ideas of evacuation, or in different terms, have been around much earlier, though the historical research into sort of the great Jewish immigration waves done by Tara Zara and Robert Chazan and others actually sort of show that it's not necessarily a Jewish immigration wave. There was a huge immigration wave of the impoverished masses from Eastern Europe to America and the US, to America and to the UK, and Jews sort of constituted a part of it. But even though it was later depicted as sort of a Jewish sort of self-assertive action, it was not necessarily particularly Jewish. But that's just to add another sort of angle to the question of Jewish migration and its political or its broader political meanings. In the interwar period, the question was really difficult because there was really nowhere to go to. Even Palestine, which was so much on the agenda, was not open to immigration, at least not on a large scale, which was why both left-wing and right-wing Zionists tried to look for different sort of political constellations which could open the sort of the gates of Palestine in order to sort of advance it. In hindsight, of course, there's a lot of reproach on whether more could have been done, both by Jewish parties but most of all by the British government in order to save European Jews. But again, much of it is only as part of post-Holocaust reckoning with the crisis of the 1930s. So one of the things that makes sort of Jabotinsky's plan worth historical attention is the fact that it sort of it did recognize that there was a serious crisis that demands urgent action, including negotiating with governments that are openly hostile to Jewish presence in Poland. But the fact that he was sort of attaching it to Palestine only and not to other destinations, which again is always sort of a part of the moral dilemmas of Zionist diplomacies, also in the war period, or makes this sort of issue of more politically and historically loaded. So I'm trying to sort of tackle this question without the sort of the post-Holocaust sensitivities and the questions of what Zionists should have done and so on, but just to understand sort of the different deadlocks of Jewish international politics that were both practical, but as I showed, also somewhat symbolically laden and so on. So yeah. Thank you.
Marc, I wonder if I can take you back to our earlier conversation, our earlier part of the conversation, where we were talking about what is distinctive about the dilemmas of Jewish politics in these years. And I found your answer really interesting because you spoke about the emergence of a new sort of Jewish leadership after Herzl. In other words, what was new was the ways in which Jews were actors in new ways, and I'm sure that's really very important and something that I need to go away and think about more. But I also wonder to what extent these sorts of dilemmas that you're researching and writing about arise from the way in which basically the institutions and structures of politics were being cast anew after 1918. So without the collapse of the empires at the end of the First World War, it's hard to imagine people thinking about creating a World Jewish Congress without the failure of the new Polish nation state, of the post-imperial nation state, and its failure to adequately accommodate its Jews. It's impossible to think about the evacuation plan, the idea of evacuation and the controversies around that. So I wonder whether there's a dimension of your project which can actually illumine these these new and quite profound elements, it seems to me, in the world in which Jews were trying to act.
Right. Yes, I mean, that's a good point, and I take it. In some ways, yes, the structural changes that took place with the World War and its consequences are indeed structural changes that sort of change the feasibility of certain ideas. On the other hand, these ideas had been sort of circulating already beforehand. They just didn't sort of catch fire as they did afterwards. There was a discourse about the need to establish, a Jewish Congress at the national level, in Austria and in the Russian Empire, in Hungary. None of them succeeded, but the appeal of the Congress as an institution was something more, also the Zionist Congress was in some ways riding on this image of the Congress of the people. It hoped to reach the status of a representative of the Jewish people, but until that happens, it remains sort of a party Congress. But nonetheless, the universal nationalizing vision was there. Shomer also sort of thought about his ideas, in 1906, 1907, but again, it didn't really succeed in communicating them. During the war, Nachman Sirkin and others sort of tried to sort of advance ideas of a Jewish Congress, but more as a sort of a lobbying group with popular legitimacy rather than, as a broad Congress as it was pushed from the bottom up initiatives. So it's true. I mean, just like in many other, historical cases, the ideas have been sort of circulating there, I think, but sort of the historical constellation of the early 1920s created sort of new opportunities and very serious dangers for, Jewish ways of pronouncing their collectivity and their national allegiances. That's part of the sort of the drama of the period, which in some ways has been captured, but could be sort of, understood even better, I think, because the question of anti-Semitism and antisemitism remains sort of such a sort of an open and difficult topic to address in the political sphere and in the Jewish sort of public sphere more broadly. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Marc. That was extremely acute and insightful and interesting answer, and indeed, like everything else that you've had to say to us this afternoon, it just remains for me to thank you very much for sharing your work and your thoughts with us. It's been every bit as interesting and as stimulating as I thought and hoped it would be. And thank you, everyone who's come along at this lunchtime. Without your presence, there really wouldn't be any point in putting on a seminar, so I'm really extraordinarily grateful. And this is our last lunchtime seminar of this academic year, but we will be back with more in the autumn. Thank you all very much, and thank you again, Marc.
Thank you.